This video was brought to you by Brilliant. In the last week, Ukraine has made progress in two areas, to the north of Bakhmut and to the east of Zaporizhia, where, over the weekend, Ukrainian forces captured the town of Patykatki. While these are non-trivial advances, not least because Patykatki will provide the Ukrainians with their first attempt on Russia's defensive lines, the overall pace of the counter-offensive has apparently slowed, and Ukrainian sources told the Washington Post at the weekend that Ukraine's high command has decided to take a pause ahead of the counter-offensive, which, contrary to what some Russian military bloggers have claimed, is still yet to begin. So in this video, we're going to have a look at where Ukraine has made gains, why Ukraine has paused its counter-offensive, and what might happen next. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's start with the changes on the battlefield. As we see it, since we did our last Ukraine video, there are basically two places where Ukraine has made progress: Bakhmut and Zaporizhia. Let's start with Bakhmut. In the past few weeks, the Ukrainians have been making steady progress on the north and south flanks of Bakhmut. Last week, the Ukrainians made good progress in the south around Klishchivka. Since then, it looks like the Ukrainians have made further gains, this time to the west of Bakhmut, in the fields to the northwest of Yahidne. Now, it's important not to overstate these gains. They're only a few kilometers, and Ukraine hasn't retaken any significant urban settlements. Nonetheless, according to Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar, Ukraine's advances around Bakhmut have forced Russia to transfer more troops to the area, which could allow the Ukrainians to make. Speaking of elsewhere, in Zaporizhia, the Ukrainians' main success here has been the village of Patykatki, a small village that lies on the Zaporizhia front line. The advance was claimed by certain Ukrainian military bloggers on Saturday, before being essentially confirmed by Vladimir Rogov, the Russian-installed leader of occupied parts of Zaporizhia, on Sunday. Anyway, the Ukrainians are probably hoping to use the town as a springboard towards Vasilivka, from where they can then advance either to Tokmak, an important supply point for the Russians in the south, or straight down to Melitopol. This will be particularly interesting because it's the first place where the Ukrainians have actually reached Russia's defensive line. As we detailed in our previous video, satellite imagery suggests that Russia has two defensive lines in the east of Zaporizhia and three in the west. These defensive lines are composed of various fortifications, including trenches, shelters, anti-tank obstacles, and minefields. Certain strategically significant towns, including Tokmak, are entirely surrounded by circular ditches that can house anti-tank teams. Across most of the front line, the Ukrainians are still a few kilometers away from Russia's first line of fortifications, and most of the fighting is occurring in towns and fields. Patykatki is just before Russia's first offensive line, and it'll be interesting to see just how effective these fortifications actually are. If Russia's defensive lines around Patykatki are effective and the Ukrainians struggle to make further gains in the area, then this won't bode well for Ukraine's counteroffensive. If Russia really does have three well-prepared defensive lines in Zaporizhia, then making significant progress in the south will be difficult for Ukraine. If, however, Russia's defensive lines aren't quite as well fortified as you'd expect, or the collapse of Russia's first defensive line triggers a domino effect with the second and third lines, then things will look more promising for Ukraine. Nonetheless, the overarching story here is that the front lines have stayed relatively stable in the past few days, and some analysts have suggested that this might be because the Ukrainians have temporarily paused their offensive to focus on striking Russian logistics points. An Estonian intelligence official, for example, suggested last week that Ukraine is essentially taking a week-long pause from operations. And a day later, Ukrainian sources told the Wall Street Journal that Ukrainian forces had, quote, mostly paused their advances in recent days, while Ukraine's high commander re-examined its tactics. This could be because Ukraine decided to prioritize putting pressure on Russia's logistics. Since this pause was announced, there's been a significant uptick in Ukraine's strikes on Russian ammo depots behind the front lines, with 12 separate targets struck over the weekend, according to the Financial Times. At around the same time, there were also reports of further strikes in Belgorod, occupied Kherson Oblast, and northern Crimea, presumably carried out by pro-Ukrainian saboteurs. As well as putting pressure on Russia's supply line, it could be that the Ukrainians want to rethink their counter-offensive strategy a bit. While the Ukrainians have made significant gains, they haven't been as rapid as more optimistic Western analysts were originally predicting, or as rapid as what happened in, say, Kharkiv last year. As we argued in our last video, this should be unsurprising. A Kharkiv-style advance was never likely, given the depth of Russian fortifications, and in a way, what happened in Kharkiv set expectations too high. Nevertheless, it does look like Russia has changed tactics recently, and Ukraine's high command might have decided to take a pause to amend tactics accordingly. In the beginning of the war, Russian forces were almost totally reliant on heavy artillery to pave the way for their advances. According to interviews by Ukrainian soldiers and Russian prisoners of war given to the New York Times last week, Russia's military philosophy has been amended recently, and one of the big changes has been an increased use of aircraft, where Russia enjoys near total superiority, and drones, which are often more effective than the artillery Russia used to rely on. According to Ukraine's military bloggers, there's been a significant increase not just in Russian jets, but also Russia's Ka-52 attack helicopters, which have made Ukrainian advances in the south significantly more difficult. Ukraine's high command might be taking a pause to wait for the West to deliver new weapon systems that might challenge, or at least mitigate, Russia's air superiority before they commit more troops. As we mentioned in our previous video, while we have indeed seen some Leopards and Bradleys on the battlefield, Ukraine is still yet to deploy its full force. Given that a brigade of 4 or 5 armed battalions should have something like 200 armoured vehicles of various types, and assuming the main offensive involves at least a few brigades, this means we should expect the main offensive to involve hundreds of vehicles concentrated in a narrow front. This clearly hasn't happened yet, and while it did look like Zaporizhia would be the stage for the main offensive, Ukraine's high command might be reconsidering deploying their full force there, given their limited progress so far. This might sound like a failure, and Russian military bloggers are presenting it as such, but, well, this is exactly what probing attacks are for, finding weak points in your enemy's defences and exploiting them. Having watched an 8-minute video explaining the intricacies of Ukraine's counter-offensive, it's fair to say you have a desire to learn and better your knowledge of modern conflicts and global politics. Well, we've got something that you might enjoy and will continue your online educational journey. Brilliant. Brilliant is an online STEM learning platform where you can learn everything from quantum computing or algebra to logical decision making. And if you don't want to learn more about the world from simply just watching YouTube videos, then you're in luck, because Brilliant actually teaches you by doing, using active learning techniques to teach you the principles behind otherwise complex subjects, and ensuring you actually understand what's going on. And rather like a good TLDR news video, Brilliant breaks topics down into accessible chunks, which you can work through whenever you have time. There's no homework, there's no deadlines, and there's no core classes. You can spend anything from a few minutes to a few hours a day accumulating new knowledge in an actually fun way. So whether you want to brush up on your basic math skills, improve your employment prospects by learning about future technologies, or just have fun with coding, you can check out everything Brilliant has to offer free for a full 30 days. Click on the link in the description. Plus, the first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Thanks for your support.